Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH, and today we are looking at Hinata Dawn Crown. So Hinata is a 4-mana Jeskai commander. It's a 4/4 flying trample, and it says spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each target, and spells your opponent cast cost 1 more to cast for each target. So that bottom ability right there basically just means that Hinata has Ward 1. But more importantly, the main ability that we are going to be building around is this middle one. Spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each target. What this means is that spells that say that you can target any number of targets or that perhaps have X in their cost can be reduced in cost by 1 for every target, meaning that we can turn spells that would otherwise have huge mana costs into much cheaper spells that give us way more value than what we're paying for them. So with that said, let's go over some of the big players. Sublime Epiphany is a 6-mana spell that has a modal ability to choose between countering target spell, countering target activated or triggered ability, so Stifle, bouncing a non-land permanent, creating a token that's a copy of another creature, or drawing a card, meaning it has 5 modes and every mode targets. So if you choose 4 to 5 modes on the spell, you only have to pay 2 mana for it when Hinata's in play. There is Magma Opus, which is deal 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets, tap 2 target permanents, create a 4/4, and draw 2 cards. So if we choose the maximum number of targets with this, it only costs 2 mana. So that's 2 mana for 4 damage divided as we choose, tapping 2 things, creating a 4/4, and drawing 2 cards. A pretty good deal there. There is Paradoxical Outcome, which bounces any number of non-land, non-token permanents back to the owner's hand and draw a card for each one. So for only a single blue mana, we can bounce every single permanent that we have, probably aside from Hinata, if we want to draw that many cards. It's notable that all of our 2 mana counter and removal spells are also reduced in cost. So spells like Delay and Negate are now only 1 mana. March of Swirling Mists is a protection spell for Hinata because it is imperative that we make sure that Hinata survives. And March of Swirling Mists is a way of doing that for only a single blue. And similarly, this card also sometimes doubles as a way to remove problematic creatures from our opponent's side of the board, usually stacks creatures. And this is a way that, again, we don't have to pay for the X cost. So this is a way to say, for example, protect Hinata and phase out all of our opponent's creatures. Similarly, Apostle's Blessing is now going to be reduced by 1, meaning we can pay just 2 life and no mana to protect Hinata. And then there is all the fun times with removal. So Aether Gale, bounce 6 non-land permanents for only 2 mana. Blatant Thievery, steal 3 permanents for only 4 mana. Byforce, pay a single red mana to blow up all of our opponent's artifacts. Curse of the Swine, for only 2 blue mana, exile all of our opponent's creatures and replace them with 2/2s. Distorting Wake, for just 3 blue mana, bounce all of our opponent's non-land permanents. Get Lost is reduced to only a single white mana. Heliod's Intervention, for only 2 white mana, we can blow up all of our opponent's artifacts and enchantments. We can also gain a significant amount of life depending on how many things we're targeting. Meteor Blast, for just 3 red mana, we can deal 4 damage to all of our opposing creatures and opponents. Red Sun's Twilight, for just 2 red mana, we can blow up all of our opponent's artifacts. And if that number is 5 or more, we get to create copies of them with haste that get exiled at the end step. Shatter Skull Smashing is a land that then doubles as a way of basically wrathing our opponent's board, depending on how many creatures they have, for only 2 red mana. Stroke of Midnight is also reduced to only being 2 mana. And finally, Unexplained Absence, which says for each player, exile up to 1 target non-land permanent that player controls. And for each permanent exiled this way, its controller cloaks the top card, so it becomes a face-down 2/2 morph creature with Ward 2. So for a single white mana, we can exile the best permanent on each of the opposing sides of the board. So as you can see, there is some very high value things that we can do with Hinata. There's also some additional cards that didn't neatly fit into what is mostly removal on that section. So that is Aurelia's Fury. Deal X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or players, and tap each creature dealt damage this way, and players dealt damage this way can't cast non-creature spells this turn. So at minimum, this is basically 2 mana non-creature silence for all of our opponents. And then for however many creatures there are in play, we can potentially burn them all out or tap them all down. Decoy Gambit says for each opponent, choose up to 1 target creature that player controls, then bounce it unless they have you draw a card. So this basically just says for a single blue mana, your opponents get a choice. For each of their creatures, they bounce the creature back to their hand or you draw a card. Either way, you're perfectly fine paying a single blue mana to unsummon / draw a card for every opposing creature in play. And then finally, Reality Spasm, tap X target permanents or untap X target permanents. So for just 2 blue mana, you can either make this sort of a silence, target all of your opponent's lands, and then they will float mana, then you just change phases, and now you've essentially cast silence, outside of a few notable exceptions like Force of Will. Or pay just 2 blue mana to untap all of our lands, otherwise known as giving this the best turnabout impression that we've ever seen. Now you may be saying, okay, I get it, Hinata generates a bunch of value with these spells, that's cool and all, but how are we actually winning the game? Well, shockingly, this is going to be one of the few commanders that doesn't actually require an infinite combo to win. We are primarily going to win by swarming the board or creating huge creatures for our opponents to deal with. So first is going to be cards like Monastery Mentor, Third Path Iconoclast, and Young Pyromancer. We obviously get a benefit of generating tokens whenever we're casting many of these non-creature spells, but importantly, by creating a bunch of these creatures, it also means that for certain X spells that we play, or any number of target spells that we play, we can then add all of the token fodder that we are creating to the list of those cards. So if we have cards that benefit from more creatures being in play, we can use the fodder creatures that we generate to benefit them. We also have creatures that go tall, so things like Shark, Typhoon, and Dika will create creatures that are as big as whatever we're casting, which in the case of many of these X spells or things like Magma Opus, are going to get really big. So when you cast, let's say, a Biforce for 11 and blow up all of our opponent's artifacts and then create an 11/11 creature, we can use this to beat down our opponents pretty quickly. Obviously, we're playing a bunch of non-creature spells, so things like Archmage Emeritus and Whirlwind of Thought are going to be pretty good. Chrome Host Seed Shark is going to be another card that sort of falls into the same line as Mentor, Pyromancer, etc. But we don't initially have the tokens start as creatures, they only start as non-creatures, although this does increase the benefit of artifact targeting spells in some instances. Feather is going to be really helpful, so when we have cards like Aurelia's Fury that we can use to target Feather, we can get those cards back and use them again. And then there's Zaphi Thunder Conductor. So this is a card that is a 4 mana 1/4, and it says whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, scry 1. If the value is 5+, you create a 4/4, and if the spell is 10+ mana, you deal 10 to a random opponent. So this is yet another way that we can use to burn out our opponents. Then there's a whole bunch of just random other cards in the deck that are in here basically just to be good value cards in the deck. So things like Mystic Remora, Ristic Study, the One Ring, Counterspell Suite. Again, it's important that Hinata survives. Jeweled Lotus and Lightning Greaves. Bunch of lands, nothing really to see here other than the aforementioned Shatter Skull Smashing. Bunch of Mana Rocks. The only thing out of the ordinary here is that Liquimetal Coating can turn other permanents into artifacts, which is relevant given that we have a number of spells that can blow up artifacts. Some removal encounters that didn't neatly fall into the Hinata synergy thing, so things like the Red Blasts, for example. A little stacks in Cursed Totem. We don't have anything really that cares about having creature activated abilities, so this can slot right in there. And then Psych Rift as a sweeper and a little bit of tutoring, including Spellseeker being particularly good when it can tutor up a number of our X spells like Biforce or Curse of the Swine. It's also notable that there were many cards that I opted not to play, which you could play in Hinata. There's tons of X spells, things like Comet Swarm and whatnot, that I decided were ultimately probably not good enough for the deck, but you could obviously decide to play them. And the other route is there's obviously a ton of spells, specifically instants and sorceries that cost 2 mana that can get reduced to only 1 mana. So that's things like Snap, Lofty Denial, Bovine Intervention, Mists of Lorien. These are all spells that could easily go into the deck that I ultimately decided not to play. So to recap, you're primarily going to use Hinata to reduce the cost of various spells, especially big multi-target spells like the X spells that we saw earlier, to generate tons of value, blow up our opponent's permanents, and then generate tons of either go wide tokens or big tokens to ultimately beat our opponents to death. And yep, that is going to be Hinata Dawncrown for EDH.